Oh, hello everybody, and welcome to the Introduction 101 to the podcast, The Scholar and the Bard. I have with me the Bard, Eric Bauberger, which just sounds like a turn of the century Flemish offer, but a good one. But and I'm Guy. I am supposedly the scholar of the pair of the two. But we are going to talk about what's in store in our podcast. Can you kind of start us off here, Eric?
Yes, and to confirm this title that we're going with, to support the scholarly nature of yourself, I had to Google the word bard, and I was like, what is a bard? Is a bard like a brute? Or there I'm like, oh no, it's it has to do with being poetic and songwriting. So I love this idea of this dance between something rooted in history and in literature and even mathematics. I see all those things kind of melding together and in one scholarly flavor almost, but obviously there's a multitude of directions it could go, and having that foundation dancing with this idea of something that's a little more formless and shapeless and more about the feeling, and less about the content and more about the uh, the direction at which it points.
Yeah, the
And perhaps these,
experiential.
yes.
Experiential is the most definitely the kind of route we are taking on together, and I'm hopeful that there are people who share the same sentiment or would like to be privy to our doings and our talks in the podcast. So, what do you think are some of the topics that we'll be covering during the podcast? For however long it will run and sustain. And I'm hopeful, and that the vision for the future is rose-colored glasses all the way.
Yeah, yeah. I think clearly we're going to talk about current events. We're going to talk about social topics, the way that they're being perceived
Mm.
in the mainstream, and the potential other ways of perceiving them in such a way that allows movement and allows evolution. Um, but just on the other side of that, the polar opposite, probably talk about things that are outside our grasp, things that are beyond life, so to speak. The other dimensions to this reality, what we experience, but we can't really put a label on, and that's where I get really excited talking about
Yes.
vibrations and frequencies and how that plays a part in everyday living.
Yeah, there are powers that are kind of, they're not hidden, but they're not manifested in raw material, shall we say. It's not something that you can perceive with your five senses. Even though we should say that the five senses are rooted inside of your consciousness, and that's a big, awful, long debate that's been lasting for the last 3,000 years, I'm guessing by this point, between the idea that the soul or the spirit, the human, was endowed with some sort of consciousness that you can perceive or quantify as a sort of spirit or a soul. And I'm not getting into that debate, I'm just trying to throw the seeds that will flower eventually during our conversations. But what about like human relationships? Like, actually being aware or increasing your self awareness or the perception of yourself in society.
Yeah, whether it be on the individual level, like a relationship between two people, or the relationship between a person and their whole environment, I come from the understanding that life is a mirror and that we're all projecting and reflecting perceptions, conditioned ways of seeing and feeling and acting. So, I would love to expand the awareness of how our thoughts create our emotions, which create our habits, which, create kind of what we physically become, or what we could be perceived as. So to really take that responsibility back and to recognize, okay, when I perceive this situation as whether or not it should or shouldn't be happening, that either that allowance or that resistance, that judgment or that compassion directly influences my energetic state. And we could easily determine whether or not something feels good, or whether or not a habit is progressive in the way that we want. So to
Hmm.
really create clarity about the role that the individual plays and the power of their mind in their human experience, and how to gain a little control back, because there's some things that we can control, like the thoughts that we give our attention to, and the habits that we give our attention to. And then conversely, there's everything that we can't control. And can we trust that letting go of all control ultimately leads to what we want?
Yeah, I used to, I didn't put too much thought into anthropology or didn't give it the time of day in the past. But now that I've learned, I've gone through the ringer in the university and have taken some courses on anthropology and stuff like this, and I'm seeing the kind of merit that anthropology possesses in some of its parts, not the whole thing. The experiential is extremely uh, important thing, the kind of the philosophical, the societal, the traditions, the customs, the religion, that's fine and well, but at the end of the day, the experiential is something that is very extremely vivid in people's lives. So, what can you say about the experiential things that you perceive with your five senses and actually live, as opposed to your consciousness, your thought, your kind of brain try to do the thinking instead of your heart, shall we say?
Yeah, it's a funny thing to try to mold in an objective way, because that human experience is so subjective. Um, what we what we perceive through our five senses is always rooted in the present moment. And some people say that's all we have, that there isn't even a future and a past, everything is always now.
Mm.
And the five senses are just using one of them is a beautiful way to anchor yourself back into the moment and back into your own awareness. Whether or not what we're experiencing feels good, which again is colored by the lens through which we look at whatever we're perceiving, that immediately influences that inner experience and how we continue to move forward with it, and how we continue to react. And I heard someone define, and this sounds so simple, but when we react rather than respond, a reaction is acting again, and and acting from a pattern. So
Hmm.
to recognize what patterns or conditioned responses of thoughts and emotions and behaviors form within the neurology of the human being, what form as a response to the stimulus to the five senses, right? So if we touch fire and it burns us, we're going to perceive fire as obviously hot in some way, but bad. Stay away from it. It's gonna be indefinitely programmed into us to not touch it again and for our safety, right? But and while that's all well and good in a moment, moving forward to then have this fear or this stress response come up when we see fire becomes inefficient because we need fire. There's a relationship between human and fire that we could coexist and be harmonious. So from that point, it's recognizing that it's this it's this ingrained belief about the fire that's leading to this fear response, even though it's no longer burning us, but our body's responding as if it very well might burn us again. So, being able to navigate between what our biology and physiology are doing to keep us safe and to the extent to which it then gets in the way. And it's that dance between what our five senses are experiencing and then what continues to play out in the mind on an unconscious level.
Yeah. So, what about the fire of creation, shall we say? One of the topics that we are going to cover, I'm guessing, is music. I have at least, a very strong relationship to music. I'm kind of a musicophile, quoting Oliver Sacks, one of his books. He was a very famous kind of a psychiatrist, if I'm not mistaken, or I don't know. I don't know. The actual professional title or the actual medical verbiage, but I know he was a psychiatrist. So, what do you think about be that as it may? What do you think about the fire of creation, that of music?
It's it's something that it can be objectified and I'm going to make up a word, maybe mathematized,
Mm.
right? We could
Yeah, I
music
think
is
I've heard that word maybe once. Mathematized. Yes, I think
okay.
so. Yeah.
So it's something that occurs in nature, right? Our hearts have a beat and move to a certain rhythm, and our lungs breathe to a certain rhythm. So rhythm and harmony, which is to me just the resonance between two separate vibrations, they occur in nature. And as we learned how to use certain instruments to create sounds, we could identify what sounds good and what doesn't sound so good. And sometimes, you know, chords that don't sound so good are still used effectively within a composition. Um, I'm not sure if you knew this, but what differentiates the way a particular note sounds between instruments is what they call the overtones. So say a flute is playing an A note and it's a vibration going up and down, crests and troughs, like a lot of other phenomena in the universe. Uh, above an overtone, so above that vibration is more subtle notes that are playing uh, at different distances, so
Yeah,
to speak.
I heard that term. I heard that term from a very wise intellectual scholar named Eric Weinstein. I'm just
Mm,
throwing, I'm the scholarly part
yeah.
of the podcast, the scholarly twin half of the podcast. So I'm just throwing it out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that you're aware of it because, talking about music in regards to into nature versus what is created by the human, um, naturally the medium through which a sound comes through creates a major sounding chord. Those overtones that play create a major chord ultimately. So the reason that we play major chords in music, no matter what the instrument, it sounds right and it sounds complete because of the nature of a single note suggests that major chord. So again, within our nature, there's rhythms, there's beats, and there's harmony, and there's keys, so to speak, of things playing with each other in a way that sounds or feels good. That being said, the human expression has the opportunity to move through various mediums, and obviously sound being the one that we're talking about now. Um, the songs that I write obviously cannot be separated from all the music that I was influenced by. You can't separate a song that I write from the influence of the Beatles and the Who and Cat Stevens and all the pop punk that I got into in the
Oh yeah.
90s, like Green Day. So everything that I write, while it may be an original expression, an original experience moving through sound, in rhythms and harmonies, it's always going to be an evolution of everything that came before it, and everything that came before it has already been suggested by nature. So, the human is certainly a vessel through which creative expression can flow freely, but it also at the same time it cannot be separated from the whole.
Mm.
So it's an interesting thing to try to be an original artist, trying to write completely new music. And while it continues to evolve, and something now might sound, 1,000 times different than something from the '60s, it's
Mm.
still connected at its core. So it's very interesting to
Yeah.
witness it in that way and appreciate it in that way.
Yeah, it's weird, you know. I've heard so much. My musical knowledge and the roster of music that I've consumed is so large by this point. You know, I'm not a connoisseur. I'm not like a total fanatic, but I've heard a lot of music, different shades, different genres, different instruments. You know, different beats and rhythms. But you know, sometimes I hear it on the radio like, yeah, I've heard that tune before. You know,
Yeah.
you're just taking, you know, the rhythm and the chord progression from the songs from the 60s and 80s and stuff like this, and you're superimposing them into a completely different beat, like artificially done in a studio, and then you know you have all the auto tunes and stuff like this and electronic and techno music that you try to, you know. I'm noticing there are more and more like classical types of bands, or more classically oriented, rock oriented bands now being popping out on the scene than before. But I would like to leave that for, you know, for the podcast. So I want to talk about actual solitude. I would like to talk about, you know, reflection, solitude, asceticism, essentially, and we've talked about it before in the context of Buddhism. So I want to talk about actually being whole in one's self, shall we say, without the need of outer, you know, stimuli.
hmm There's he was a Jesuit priest,
Mm,
but I think he was charged with heresy, and I can't remember
mm,
his name at the moment.
mm.
But he was also a psychiatrist or a psychologist, so he had a really wonderful way of talking about spirituality and philosophy and that human experience. And
Mm,
immediately, what I thought of when you're talking about that completeness unto oneself is this difference between loneliness and aloneness.
mm,
And loneliness being, that feeling of separateness, and like to say the word lonely again, but separateness and maybe a sense of lack, like
mm,
you're missing something, versus aloneness, which is that completeness unto oneself. And that place is obviously accessible through meditation, um, through walking alone in the woods, maybe through playing an instrument or listening to a song. Like you feel like you're not focusing on anything outside of that moment. The more present you could be, the more within your five senses in the now that you could be, the closer you are to that feeling of wholeness. The component of the human psyche that continues to create that loneliness and that sense of separateness, I believe, is really just rooted in judgment. All those parts of ourselves, usually subconscious or unconscious, even deeper, when we judge these parts of ourselves, I think we were talking about the shadow a bit in our last conversation.
Yes.
These parts of ourselves within, outside of our conscious awareness that we don't identify with or that we judge as wrong or shameful or whatever it is, that judgment causes that fragmentation within ourselves. And the more that we switch to compassion and understanding and that love towards those parts, the more that judgment dissipates and the more we resolve that wholeness. It's not like we're getting rid of these parts, these fears, these doubts, these guilts, but we're welcoming them back into our being, and we integrate back into our wholeness. And that ties into what was being said before, and I can't remember exactly how you said it, but and maybe I could just leave it there, but you know, recognizing that we cause this fragmentation within ourselves through our perception, whether it's conscious or not, and it's able to be restored through that self-awareness, um, through that trust that you can feel compassionate, you can feel love towards yourself, and you know it to be the right perception, we could call it, even though right and wrong is all subjective, but right to you
Yes.
because it feels good, it feels restorative.
Yeah. There's it's funny because I know from some Jewish scholars have told me that you know the right and the wrong, when you know that something is right or you sense that this is the right kind of way of going about it, or this is the right action to take right now, not there is no other moment than the now that you're experiencing. And they said when you know that something you're doing something right, you know immediately that it is the right thing to do. When you do something wrong, you know immediately that you've done something wrong. But
Hmm.
when you straddle that like gray line between is this right, is this wrong, and the balance kind of is out of wonk and it's not stabilized. You're not being dictated this is wrong, this is right. You should do this instead of this, as opposed to this. But I would like to talk about something completely different, as the Monty Python Flying Circus used to say. And now for something completely different. No one will get that reference um, apart from you and me. But but we were talking about social media and the kind of I'm not going to go into specific details of what we talk about, but just draw me the outline of our discussion about social media. We've talked about the influence of the introduction of the World Wide Web on all our lives and the kind of follies and as opposed to the advantages of technology or the advent of the social media sphere, shall we say.
It's another beautiful example of duality, and perhaps exaggerated or emphasized. Um, polarity being the natural way that this particular dimension expresses itself. We can't have up without down. We can't have, the foreground without the background. You can't have the wrong without the right or the light without the dark. The social media, it allows two people like us to connect from across the world, right? And that's an amazing, amazing thing. Different time zones, different cultures, different
It
everything.
is.
And we were able to meet through through a Facebook group for
Yeah.
podcasts, and that's incredible.
I'm literally talking with you in the future, and you're talking with me from the past.
Yes,
That's what's amazing about it.
it's incredible. You know, the value of being able to do that, to not only network and to meet like-minded people, but just for the evolution of thought and whatever else, to that progression, that is the natural way that things flow. That is a wonderful tool. At the same time, it could give a false sense of connection. The human still needs physical connection, physical touch, physical activity. And while we could feel each other's energy in this way, it must be distorted in some way just because of
Mm-hmm.
space and time. Um, on top of that, it also creates a false sense of who and what people are, because my Facebook profile picture and the statuses that I create and the events that I create, that's everything that I want people to see.
Mm.
All the things that I don't want people to see is not on there. So it's not
Yes.
it's not showing the full human,
Mm.
and it's creating a facade that someone could compare themselves to in it, which is unfair. To see like, oh man, this person, they're on vacation all the time, but it's like, no, they went on vacation this day and they're posting, one picture a day for a period of time. So so again, it's connecting us in a beautiful way, but it's also, it's the reason that depression is rising. People think they're like, "Oh, I'm being social through the media," but it's not quite as deep in the way that the human really needs. So it's a wonderful tool, but it can be dangerous. And that's all things. You could eat too much broccoli. I've heard that someone drowned by drinking too much water in a
Mm.
competition, and the
Mm.
human is mostly water. So it's both extremes, and I think it requires just simple awareness to be able to navigate in the most effective way, to recognize how it's affecting your energy, your ideas about yourself. Is it amplifying your experience in a good way, or is it getting in the way?
Yeah. We have a lot of ground to cover, I think, and just to get the general impression for the crowd or potential viewers and viewers or listeners or whatever you would like to kind of whatever pronouns you would like to use for yourself or uh, yeah, pronouns not in a derogatory term but in a kind of linguistic term, the pronoun themselves. Um, so we've covered pretty much all the bases for our discussions throughout the podcast. If you have any sort of general, um, I don't know, remarks or something you would like to share, something to expect throughout the podcast, maybe actually getting people on on the bandwagon, shall we say, of the podcast, or actually being an active member and not just a passive onlooker, shall we say.
My intention always is to point towards truth. And I hope that our discussions
Mm,
expand people's awareness of themselves and in the environment in which they participate in.
mm,
And as we expand upon that and point towards these truths or recognize these themes throughout all these different contexts and all the content that we bring, I hope that the way that we point the observer or the witness of these conversations is ultimately to that which is within them that wants to be expressed more fully and more authentically and more
Mm.
purposefully, and
Yes.
how we could use the mind and how we could use all of our resources that we have
Yes.
available to us to live very intentionally and in a very rewarding way, and simply because that's become my purpose. How could I be the most me that I could be without being lost in my ego? How could I dance between my spirit and my form,
Mm.
so to speak? So I hope that we lay this foundation for other people to recognize a similar um, a similar energy within themselves. And the word inspiration, we could break down to being in
Mm.
spirit.
Mm.
So I hope to really spark the spirit of people that listen to, however you define that, but to inspire people to question, people to converse on their own and to expand and to change and to transform and evolve
Mm.
with the ever evolving world, whether or not we want it to be.
Yeah, that's well put. And if you would like to join us, you can head over to our Patreon and subscribe, and we'll do maybe once a week or twice a month, whatever is more comfortable, and we'll see you then. Thank you so much, Eric. You're going to see me and Eric on the Scholar and the Bard on Patreon exclusively for Patreon members and followers of the podcast. Thank you.